I think we're in pretty good shape. Most of the seats are filled, so other people who come in will have to snuggle up next to the other people in here. Welcome to Irresistible APIs. My name is Kirsten Hunter. I am an API evangelist for Akamai. If you're not familiar with Akamai, we're the largest CDN at any given time. 30% of the internet comes off of one of our servers. So we're kind of a big deal. And we do have some APIs now that we're trying to help our customers integrate with to help them to use our system better. And so that's my day job. And I'm super fortunate to have a company who supports my going out into the community and talking about things that I'm passionate about, that I have experience with. So in those 10 years working with REST APIs, I have discovered a great number of resistible APIs, painful APIs, APIs that make you want to cry. And I have noticed that, by and large, what that means is the people who created the APIs did not have the developer experience in mind when they created the APIs. They created the APIs code first. They decided, I want to have an API and I'll just do this one thing. But they didn't have use cases in mind. They didn't treat their APIs like a product. So this isn't a terribly technical session. It's not, as far as I'm concerned, it's not challenging to make an API. You give me Flask, you give me Ruby, you give me Express, I can make you an API in 5 minutes. It's probably going to suck, but it's going to be a fully functional REST API. What I'm going to talk about here instead is the process that you need to go through in order to make sure that the APIs you create are the APIs that people want to use, which will make your customers happy, turn them into evangelists, but also lower your support burden, which is one of the biggest problems with making poor APIs. Also, this is more of a workshop and less of a lecture. I would rather it be a conversation. So if you all have a question, shout it out, raise your hand. I am happy to have your input. There will be time at the end for questions as well, but I'll just ramble on and listen to myself talk all day long. I know what I have to say, so I'm actually really interested in what you guys have to say, what questions you have, challenges that you think of. So please feel free to participate. So why do you want to have an API? The first thing that comes to everyone's mind is, I will make an API and then I will monetize it and it will sprout money and fly off into the world. Okay, that's not how it works. There are a few companies with whom that works. Twilio, which does SMS and phone telephony things. Those are hard things, and they charge you a little bit of money to do that a lot in your applications. SendGrid, Context.io, Clarify.io, all of these services are run directly from an API. In that case, monetization makes a lot of sense. But if your company has a main product and you're going to have an API, I would strongly suggest that you just forget the whole money thing and think of the API as an enhancement to your main product. Don't expect it to sprout money and fly. Expect to be able to sell more of your product because your product is much better with this richness which allows people to integrate with it. Your API is a product, even if it's not going to sell and make money. It's a product. It needs to be thought of as a first-class product, not as an afterthought or a hobby or something that we'll get around to when we have a chance. So the first thing to think about when you're thinking about an API is, tell me a story. Tell me a story of one of the users, one of the customers of your product, or a potential customer of your product. How they're sad now because they can't do a thing. And then after you have your API, they will be able to do the thing, and they will be happy. This is the kind of thing you need to do for use cases. You need to come up with something that someone really wants to be able to do that they can't currently do, and then enable them to do it. At the very, very top level, this is critical. What is the business value for your company? Why do you have an API? So many companies, if the CEO comes to the API team and says, hey, API team, why do we have an API? And they're like, well, because API, right? Everybody's got to have one of those. Like, it's a thing. Everybody needs an API. And then the CEO takes your resources and puts them on an actual revenue-generating product, and you don't get to have an API anymore. So you need to be able to communicate something valuable to your executives and to your management team and to your development team as to why this product is going to make your company more successful. If you have a mobile device, a mobile social interface, usage might well be something that you want to improve and increase using an API. Maybe you want to get more people to write to your timeline. Twitter is a great way to think about this. So Twitter wants people to read regularly what's happening in Twitter. That's a value that they give. But the other value is that fire hose needs to have more interesting things in it. So they have these share buttons on all of these websites all over the world in order to put more content into Twitter. So Twitter is not making money off of those shares into their timeline, but their timeline is becoming more valuable as more people integrate with it. And they don't want it to just be people on the Twitter website, because that just doesn't happen. They want to have Twitter sort of be able to reach out into the other things that people are doing on the web and share some of that back with their timeline. So what does that mean? That means we can think about it as increasing the usage of the platform by the people who are interested in the platform. Partner connectivity. This is my favorite. There are no CEOs who are going to take away your resources if you say, if we have this API and it works well and partners integrate with it, then they will not go to our competitors. They will stay with us. Because once a development team has done an integration, this product manager over here says, oh, I have this great idea. Let's go to this competitor. And the development team is like, what? I wrote you code. It works fine. I'm not making you anything else. Not for you. So this is one of the most valuable reasons to have an API. And it seems sort of unsexy, partner integration. But truly, it's one of the biggest benefits you can give to your company. Create that kind of stability where you know that you're going to have that relationship with those larger companies going on into the future. But how are you going to measure success? Okay, so now we have a value. We have something we can say to the CEO in the elevator and get out and still have an API. That's great. But what else do those executives really love? They love graphs and charts. Oh, they're so wonderful. So we tend, as API providers, to think of the best metric as how many developers have a key. Does that actually seem like a good metric? Not really. How many developers with a key have made a call? A little closer. Still not good. You want to have metrics that measure based on those business values that you've come up with. User activity. So now we're back to the usage, right? So what are the users doing? Are they writing a lot through the API? Are they writing more through the API than they are through the main product? Are they behaving differently? Do we get a different kind of a interaction? So that's a thing that you can measure. Web versus API. Yes, it is the dread Pirate Roberts. And he's the API side because it's the cool side. So, web versus API, what does this mean? It costs you a lot to render a web page. You have to render images, you have to render CSS, you have to render the HTML itself. You're going to have some AJAX on there. You're going to have, if someone else wants to create an application based on your API to support your product line, and you're sending them JSON, the system is doing a lot less work than it is for the web. So that's one of the things you can measure. How many people are interacting with the API versus how many people are interacting with it via the web? And what can we learn about our product from the successful things in the API. Now, I realize that sounds a lot like Twitter, who says you can't actually, if you have a feature that we really like, then we're going to put it in our features, and then you can't do it anymore, which is not a good way to treat your partner developers. But it can give you some insight into things that your customers want to do that you're not supporting them with. So here's the guiding principles. Come down on high from the mountain. Don't surprise your users. I know that you have a better way, a better idea of how to create a web API. It doesn't look just like CRUD. It's different. It's better in some great way. And your error messages, you made better ones than HTTP had. And it's such a better system that you have. And so a developer comes to your site having integrated other APIs, and they have some expectations. It's going to look like HTTP. There's going to be post and delete. I'm going to be able to find the resources. There's going to be a way to do that. And then you give them the matrix, and they're like, is there another API that does this? Don't take advantage of the knowledge that your users have. Respect their time, and don't surprise them unless it's necessary. Sometimes it's necessary. REST is not always the best way to go. One of the things that you need to realize about REST is that it is not super friendly for mobile devices. If you go one resource per endpoint, you're going to have 0 mobile clients, because a mobile client needs to be able to make one call to fill a screen. So you need to be able to make it possible for them to expand a request to get other related resources. You need to be able to, Etsy, what they did was they created something called Bespoke, which aggregates several different calls and returns it as a single call. But mobile devices, they don't do parallel well. And those darn mobile users, they walk into elevators or their train goes into a tunnel, and all of a sudden your app is not performant, and it's really hard to recover when you have another 50 calls you have to make again. So you have to think, this is one of the reasons that you think so carefully about the use cases that you want to support. Mobile is one that's really important to think about. And it may be that you're not going to be able to support everything in this, expanded world. But if you have a few use cases for mobile that you can communicate to your users, your development partners, I like to call them, as opposed to the get-off-the-lawn kids that we used to think of people using our APIs. So your developer partners need to be able to make a choice in terms of mobile, and you need to at least support some of those use cases. Unless you think you're never going to use mobile, in which case you're crazy. So, deliberate design. Okay, so API first is something that I don't know how many of you have heard about. It's kind of an API thought leader thing that we all yammer about. But let me just sort of put it to you this way. What we used to have is we have the back end. It's the systems and the databases and all of the code it would run. And then we'd have the front end, and the front end would call directly to the back end, and it would do its thing. And then someone says, hey, we need an API. And so they would build from the back end this vestigial limbs that come out to the side. And they would all be independent. They usually wouldn't have anything to do with each other. There wouldn't be any architecture plan. It would be just like, I need this endpoint. And it would look a lot like your database schema, which I don't know how to tell you this, but it's not a really usable API, not super friendly. So I always say that what you end up with in that world is that potato that you left in the garage for 30 minutes, or for 30 days, and now it has these sprouts coming out, and they all look ugly. Nobody wants them. Nobody wants your potato API. It's just not a thing. So instead, what you want is you want a world where you have a back end. You have a API layer, and then you have your front end. And your API layer, that's the same stuff that you expose to your customers. Maybe not all of it, maybe just some of it, but it is consistent. We don't have duplicate code. We're not running into inconsistent features and inconsistent resources. All of these things happen when we have the potato, and they don't happen when we're API first. So my company is actually going API first gradually over a couple of years. Every time something new happens, it gets put on this new platform. Etsy went API first in a flurry of all at once. New companies can do API first, which they always complain to me that it's a terribly lot of work, but it makes your iterations faster. It gets your teams to talk to each other. There's just a lot to be done with that. And what goes with that is deliberate design. You need to have some overall idea of the architecture of your APIs and how they're going to work together. Ideally, all of the APIs for your company are considered with respect to each other. So I'm going to break out of my slides and bravely go onto the internet and share with you guys. See what it is I'm looking at. Oh, HaikuDeck. By the way, my slides, those slides with the pretty pictures and a few, that's HaikuDeck. Highly recommended. I do tech talks, but whenever I'm talking about something that's abstract, I like you guys just to look at a pretty picture and then listen to me. Everybody reading my slides is not any fun. Then it's story time. We all nap. It's awesome. So this is my company, Akamai, and we use, how many of you are familiar with schema modeling? Okay, so a lot of you are probably familiar with SOAP, right? So in the SOAP world, there was a contract. You said, give me your contract, and it said, here's your contract. You can get this and this and this, and it's going to look exactly like that. Not a big spur to innovation, but at least you knew what the coupled calls looked like, and you had some sort of expectation of what was going to happen. So we went to REST, and when we went to REST, everyone was like, I don't have to have a WSDL anymore. And then all of the developers are going to make perfect APIs every time because we all know exactly what we're doing, and we're never lazy, and we don't cut corners, and it'll be perfect. Okay, so that's not how that worked. So one of the sets of tools that you can use are, I'll talk slowly because this one comes up very slowly, are schema models. So a schema model describes your REST API. It describes each endpoint. It describes what a request is going to look like. It describes what the response is going to look like. It tells you all of the things that you need. Let me, if I make it smaller, there we go. So we use API Blueprint right now. There's also RAML. There's also Swagger, which is now Open API. I didn't mention yet that I'm writing a book on irresistible APIs, and in that book there's an entire chapter on modeling APIs. But let me just show you what now I'm going to get up and walk away from the microphone. So this basically shows you for the location, it's got a description. This is what a 200 response is going to look like, so you can see what those fields are going to look like. You can actually say what the different errors are going to look like. You basically are building a map to your API. And one of the things that you get for free, you don't usually get things for free, but one of the things that you get for free with all three of the main schema modeling languages is you get this free documentation, which is completely built from that blueprint. But also over here, we can see what the request and response is going to look like. So now as a developer, you have the opportunity to see exactly what it is that you're going to get back from that. So this is still reference documentation. When I talk about documentation, I will mention a few other kinds of documentation. Unfortunately, the documentation we all have, which looks like this or not quite as good as this, tends to say, what does each endpoint do? And when you come into a new API, that's not the question you have. The question you have is, why do I care? And this can be broken down into what can I do with this and how do I do it? So, but for the reference stuff, I highly recommend taking a look at the schema modeling, even as just an exercise. Even if you don't use it for your documentation, it makes it possible for you to compare your different API endpoints and make sure that you're keeping that consistency so that your partner developers can easily integrate new things. Oh, no, we were on. We're using Haiku Deck. Interface choices. So I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about too highly technical stuff, and I'm not. But interface choices are very important. So when we're trying to figure out how to deal with that mobile application, we can do what, there's different ways to go about it. The Netflix way was to say, okay, they use Hypermedia, which is fantastic. So they would say, here's the movie. And these are hyperlinks to other things that are related to this movie. And you could say expand and pick one of those hyperlinks, pick one of those pieces of information like cast or director or genre, and have that expanded in that same call. Right now, because what Netflix does with its API is the devices, all of the devices want all of the things expanded all of the time. That's just the way it is. And it works extremely well because there's a big fat pipe for your Xbox since it's going to be streaming Netflix for you next. So no amount of JSON is really going to stress your bandwidth when you're playing with your Xbox. So the other interface choice LinkedIn made, LinkedIn has sadly also shuttered their open API, mostly of the interesting things. But when you were doing a query with LinkedIn, you could say, I want this person's connections. And for each of their connections, I want to know what school they went to, and then I want to know the city of the school that they went into. But I don't want any other information about those contacts. I just want these specific pieces of information. It was complicated query language to understand, but it was super powerful, and I liked it. You can, when you try to make your resource model, you try to make it as clear as possible. You can have the same thing show up. So if it's pages, tags, foo, you can also have tags, foo, pages. It's fine for the same resource to show up in different places if this context makes sense for that. So take the time to figure out what kind of use cases there are. Don't artificially restrict yourself to any particular interface. Just try to make sure that it supports those use cases you identified as important. Oh yes, the Bansky picture. The last Appy Strat, we all decided that we would have a Bansky photo in each of our things. So this one is still here, and it is true. There's a thing called API Commons. It's just getting started, and basically it is a place where companies and organizations are encouraged to put the schema for their API so that other people can use that same schema. So if you think about it, Fitbit does steps and calories, they have users, they have activities, and so does Runkeeper. And wouldn't it be great if you integrated one of those and then you integrated the other one with just the same? The companies tend to think of the schema that they make as their secret sauce, as their intellectual property. That's what's making their stuff valuable. If what's making your stuff valuable is your API schema, you're kind of screwed. Because as soon as you put out your API, everyone knows what your API schema is. So what the calculations you're doing in the back end and how you're presenting that information and restoring that information, that's what's important. So API Commons, the idea is I'm using Fitbit steps at version 2, I'm using Twitter's user at version 1, and you're standing on the shoulders of giants. You're taking other people's APIs that they've spent a lot of time making really successful, and you're encouraging people to interface with your system in the same way. So, stand on the shoulders of giants. Let's try to make it a world where a developer who wants to use an API has the lowest amount of friction possible. So they can just slide right into that new API, integrate it with other stuff, and create amazing things. Architecture choices, once again. So I told you things, you could do with the query model, and you can have Hypermedia. And then I'm quoted many times as saying, if you don't prioritize usability at the front, you're never going to have to worry about scalability at the back. It's you and your 4 friends, and you're all using your API. It's gonna be great. If it's not usable, people won't use it. And if they have to use it because they're an internal customer, they're going to give you so much grief. You're going to have, your entire life will be spent doing support for people who are forced to use a system that they hate. And then they'll try to scrape. It's just not a good thing to set up that kind of relationship. Okay, so schema modeling I talked about. So one of the great things about a schema model is that you now have an artifact for understanding. You have product managers and project managers in other groups, and you want to explain to them how the API is going to work because they want to integrate it into their product. Now you have a piece of paper that talks about the API in an abstract way that you can communicate with your internal customers, more importantly, your external customers. If your external customers say, hey, I have this use case, you can look against it and say, oh yeah, that's going to work. Oh, hey, it sounds like we should put a couple of extra fields here, right? So before you even start coding, you have the opportunity to show people how the API is going to work, how it's going to work against the use cases, and exactly what it is that you're aiming to do. The developer experience. This is the number one thing that you need to focus on. If the developers have an excellent experience using your API will be successful. It will be as successful as it can possibly be given the other constraints that you have around it. The developers who are using your API, you want it to be engaging and fun. You want them to feel like you gave them some Legos and they get to build a spaceship. You want them to feel like it's a game, it's simple, and they can just build whatever they want. Marketing to developers is not like marketing to regular people. I am frequently quoted as saying marketing to developers is not like marketing to real people. We're real people. It's all good. I'm not trying to diss you, but I am saying that death by PowerPoint is a thing that developers have. We get an ego. We just words and pictures. We like diagrams, kind of, but when a diagram gets on a PowerPoint, it's like so hard to follow that you just have no idea what it's talking about. What do you do instead? Well, give them toys. Give them tutorials. This is how you do this thing. Make it a choose your own adventure. Like, hey, first you're gonna figure out how to get a token so you can authenticate. Right on, you authenticated with a token. Let's make a search now. You can, in my company, I have several APIs that were built before we were really doing a good job with the API design stuff. And so I have sample code that shows people how to run it. It's mostly in Python because it's easier to read than, say, if I use Perl. Our developers love it. And we have a getting started guide. One of the things that you think should be super simple is getting started. It's not. No matter how your authentication scheme works, even if you're doing OAuth vanilla, same as everybody else, go ahead and give people a quick walkthrough, 5 minutes to first call, best case. Think about Twitter. So one of the things on Twitter is that you get your keys on Twitter, and one of the hard things about OAuth is that you have to go get keys for the user so that you can make a call, as the user on the system. Twitter's like, oh, dude, man, let's just use OAuth and get you a couple of tokens. Now you just paste this into your sample code, and you can just get going right away. So there's that 5 minutes to first call. The 5 minutes to first call is something that Twilio came up with a long time ago, and it really is important that you get some sort of interaction happening between the developer and the system. Think of it as this. When a developer comes to your API, you have purchased 5 to 10 minutes of their time. Again, we're respecting their time. It's the one thing they're never going to get back. They're giving you their time, and you need to make it clear that you value that. So they come, they play, they get a call, and they get something back from the system. Okay, you've bought like 20 more minutes. I mean, you're now on the point where you can actually have them do something that's more exciting than just making a single call. Always keep that in mind. Always keep that timeline in mind. At any time you have sort of a rabbit hole where they can fall into and stop getting progress and being engaged, try to hide that rabbit hole for later on when they're super engaged. And make sure that the things that the calls to action that they have are things where they're going to really get a good idea about your API as soon as possible. Documentation, again, developer experience is heavily based on documentation and not what does this endpoint do, but how do I do it? How do I do a thing? What can I do? What are other people doing with this? Why do I even care about your API? We have started adding to all of our documentation a uses tab. And the uses tab is, here's some workflows with our APIs. So for instance, if you need to make a call to this API, in order to get some information to make a call to another API, in order to get some information to make a call to another API, and then finally get to call the API that you wanted to call in the first place, that's a thing that you should really document. You should make it easy for the developers to figure out what it is they're trying to do and how to do it. Code samples, I like. Signing clients, I like. SDKs, if you have an SDK, go back and make your API again. An SDK for a REST HTTP web service says that you didn't do a good job. It's too hard. And APIs should not be hard. An SDK puts a situation where, well, there's a few disadvantages. So one of them is, user has a problem. Okay, is the problem in the user's code, or is it in the SDK, or is it on the server side? So now you've introduced this abstraction. It's also not possible for you to say, hey, user, I see that you're having a problem. What does the HTTP traffic look like? And they're like, I don't know, I just said make a profile, and it didn't work. And they don't know how they're actually interacting with the API. So the other thing about SDKs, if I haven't scared you enough by making it sound marginally bad, if you have 10 SDKs and you rev your API, you have a huge amount of technical debt and nobody wants to do it. So either your SDK is behind, or you spent 10 times longer than you needed to get everything ready to go out to the users. Support. So yeah, it's important to have good support, but it's not important how the support works. It's more important that you communicate to your developers how you expect them to ask questions. Could be Stack Overflow. You know, that's perfectly reasonable. We have a forum. We check it every day. We make sure the spam bots don't come along and tell people about baseball betting. I go out and I talk to my customers. I give them API boot camps that are 2 hours long, wherever they are in the world. Our job as developer evangelists, as the developer relations team, is to make sure that developers are successful. And when you are an API support person, that's what you need to do. You need to make sure that everybody is successful. Now, we've talked about business value. We've talked about use cases and metrics. We've talked about architecture choices. We've talked about all sorts of things. I worked at Netflix, and Netflix believed that the information that we give to the API partner developers should be minimal. We should not tell them things because they were children and could not be trusted to understand things. The opposite of that is Google. And they will just spray all sorts of things at you, like, we're going to deprecate this in 6 months, and it turns into this sort of fire hose of information from Google about APIs. But you know what? That's better. It really is better for you to know. It's not better for a company that had an open API to suddenly go from we have 10 people supporting you to we have a person who's allowed to check the forums once a week for a half an hour. That's starving your API developers. It's not going to make anybody like you, but it's also going to create a huge support burden. Because even if you're not planning to support those APIs, you have to somehow couch the message in, we'll put that on the roadmap when you aren't really gonna. I left 2 jobs because I refused to lie to developers. I was put in a situation where they were like, well, just sort of make it seem like, and I'm like, okay, no. That's not me. I am the face of your API, and you're asking me to be false to these people who are my customers. So communication. You may think your developers have no concern for your business value. That's not true. Not anymore. Twitter, LinkedIn, Netflix, people want to know why you have an API because they'd kind of like to know if that API is going to be around tomorrow. Metrics, well, how are you going to measure your success? What do they care? Well, they care. If you say, we're measuring how many times people write to the timeline, and that's how we're going to determine if the API is successful, that developer is going to go, well, I should probably have things that write to the timeline so that they can be successful because I'm spending my time trying to make this app. The choices that you make that are hard, the choices that you make that are, we can't expose this particular piece of information. We have to make a change. All of those things, be honest. Treat them as partners. And then what you get is trust. And the only way to have an irresistible API, the only way to have an API that people are comfortable with, that they believe will be around, that they will evangelize for you, is for them to trust that you're telling them the truth. This API is important to our company. It's going to be around. You can go ahead and plan on using it. Okay, so all intelligent discourse on the internet ends as soon as you post a picture of a cat. So I found a super cute cat. It's not my pet. I think next time it's going to be my pet. So does anybody have any questions? And it can be about anything. Seriously, wrote a book on irresistible APIs. So if you have a question, it's probably somewhere in my brain. Yes?
Not so much a question, just an added benefit, I guess, to what you were making about building API first.
Yeah.
Is you're basically, if you can create sort of a customer relationship with your front-end people,
yes,
you can discover a lot of pain points for API design and extractions early on in the process rather than have to suffer through it and make your community members suffer
yes.
quite a lot. It might be a little more painful up front, but you want that out of the way early on.
Well, it also protects your backend.
Right.
So if you are going to switch over from MySQL to Mongo because your Craigslist and MySQL can no longer handle alter tables of that size, the front end doesn't need to know anything. You already have a contract. And as long as you keep with that contract and it does exactly the same thing, you're good to go. Decoupling things is, as we all know, as developers, a good idea. It's just not sexy.
Speaking of Netflix, like maybe 8 years ago or so,
yeah.
They had a flurry of people being able to access Netflix by zip code, and movies were being shown, people making up maps. Is that an example of an API going amok?
That was not an API. That was the contest.
Okay.
And
Why stop?
because of privacy issues.
Okay.
Because somebody in Mississippi it was possible to determine based on the zip code and whatever the other, I think it was like the birth date and zip code or something, that he was gay. And he was not happy about that. So, yeah, they tried to abstract that information the best they could, but the people who they were targeting, the incredibly intelligent algorithm people who wanted to win $1 million by making the Napoleon Dynamite problem go away. You guys know what the Napoleon Dynamite problem was, right? Oh, so all of the movies in Netflix are in this web, right? Where people who like this like that, and people who like this like that, and so they can give you a pretty good idea. Napoleon Dynamite fit nowhere. People loved it, they hated it. They loved it and Casablanca. They hated it and, Mega Shark versus Giant Octopus. They could not, it did not fit. And so they needed a new algorithm that somehow took into account this wacky, wacky movie that people liked or didn't like completely with no disregarding anything else that they knew. That was why there was the $1 million, it was called the Napoleon Dynamite problem. So now you all want to go see Napoleon Dynamite and see what's up with it, right? It's actually a pretty good movie, but I can see there's a lot of people who would hate it and like it, and then
Take it again.
yeah. Anyways, yes.
Can you talk briefly on versioning and evolving your API?
See, I always avoid versioning because I know, and then if nobody asks me questions, then I ask myself a question on versioning because I knew you all wanted to know. The first thing I want to tell you about versioning is that when you make a version, you will never ever get rid of it. You can make plans to deprecate it, and and people will move for the new things, and there will be like 20 guys who wrote their code, and it works fine. And you haven't. I mean, you can deprecate it. You can do what Twitter did. But there is a huge cost associated with it. So think very carefully. When you are making your first API, remember that it is okay to be additive on an API. Because we're not letting people take the XML and find the fifth line or whatever. It's not going to happen. So you can be additive. You don't have to have a new version until you have breaking changes. And I will tell you a cautionary tale about, because you'll think, oh, well, there'll just be a few people over there, and then we'll just give them cookies, and then they can come to the new version. It'll be great, and then we won't have to support it. There was a company, Ken Lane is a friend of mine, the API evangelist, and he worked at a company where they had an old version of the API with one customer on it. And then they were on version 7 for everyone else. And he came in, he's like, well, why don't we just get rid of that API? It's just one customer, right? We should do. They're like, yeah, that customer brings in $500,000 a month. Okay. That's their API. We're not taking it away. It's good. It's awesome. So just be aware of that. As far as putting where you put the version, I like having a default. But a lot of times that doesn't work out. Like if you say default, in the URL was never my favorite, but it is more my favorite now because it makes it much easier to triage issues. If you can see what version somebody's trying to use, putting it in a header, you're not going to as likely to get that information back when they ask the question. So be very mindful. Pick really cool things to put in your newer versions, and you'll bring along 80%, and then you'll have to do something with these other people. Does that make sense?
So if you're not versioning your API, what's the best way to make changes, add new features, remove stuff, and restructure your what's being?
If you're making changes, you're going to have versions. Now, one of our APIs at Akamai, this is very, very complicated. It allows you to do all of the configuration management, including deploying product properties and everything. So it's had to have some breaking changes because some customers say that that it doesn't work this way for me. So what we did there was we had a rule set. And there's a rule set you can freeze at a particular version. And the API will continue to behave in that particular way, and it's part of the metadata of that object. So then you can move to default, later when you want to make a change. But, that allowing people to define their own essential version in a way that makes sense for the API is good. You got a version if you're going to make breaking changes.
That's why architect and design right up front.
Exactly. And like I said, additive is good. And when I say additive is good, I want to point out that if you start out with an API that doesn't have Hypermedia and you want to add Hypermedia, that does not break your API. It just makes it better. So make your API simple and then decide, hey, Hypermedia is a great idea. And shove it in there. No problem. People who weren't using Hypermedia won't use Hypermedia. People who start using Hypermedia will think that you're, bleeding edge, awesome A-list API. Anything else?
I'd like to make a comment for the API. In the application role with SolidWorks, they'll say it's, this particular function is obsolete, but they add on to, they tack a number on to the end of the function name
Right.
for each new version. But all the previous ones will still work, so all your old application programs will still work. So they never really have a cutoff, but they add new version numbers to each method that they add.
Yeah, that sounds like a maintenance nightmare to me.
Well, as long as you haven't changed your code.
Yeah, but what if something breaks in version, 6 out of 12? Then you got to fix it in version 6. Is it also fixed in version 7? Lots and lots of versions is, once again, a huge technical debt. If you're going to make a new version, you need to think it up from scratch. Make sure it covers all of the things that you now know that you need to do, and make sure that it's a good addition as opposed to the potato model, where we're like, oh, just grow another sprout. Yes.
Do you ever have any social tactics or tools to get people to maybe upgrade from one version to another in the API?
Yes, you do. You can awesome things. You can add push notifications, which everybody wants, and you don't usually have in your first version. You can add better search capabilities. That always makes everybody happy. You can put so here's an example from Akamai. So since we have all these caches, right? So we have this purge functionality. And purge functionality took 7 minutes 8 months ago. Now it takes 4 minutes. Our competitors are at 50 milliseconds, so we needed to improve. Well, so from version 2 to version 3, we're going to 5 seconds. Okay, so a lot of our customers are going to be moving along to version 3 because version 2 is never going to be 5 milliseconds, right? So this is a great example of we have re-architected the back end, and the new version of the API is using that part of the product. And so we're going to get everyone moved forward so that almost everyone is using this API, which is the featureful one. So that's a great example. If you can improve something really drastically, then people will flock to your new API. Yes?
What about, maybe security standards or best practices evolve, and older versions of the API use sort of antiquated authentication or something where it's no longer acceptable to kind of keep it going, or how do you?
So what I would say is I would create a migration path for the older authentication, and I would try to get the older versions of the API using the newer version of the authentication And again, with signing libraries, so it would be a drop-in sort of a situation. If we know that there is security problems, especially at Akamai, if we know that there's security problems within a previous version of something, we will fix it. But we would make a very nice migration path for our customers. Anyone else? Yes?
So remove, don't do SDKs.
Yeah.
So Akamai, what is your alternative? Are you just getting more code examples and snippets? And
code examples and signing libraries. I do not consider a signing library to be an SDK. I think signing libraries are super important. Our authentication is a little bit more complicated than OAuth. It's critically important that we have good signing libraries, and then we have sample code in 9 different languages at this point to do a few easy calls. And
at the same time, but into documentation.
Yeah. But if you have something that does all of the calls, you're missing the point. It's just a HTTP call to an endpoint.
Yeah.
There's something wrong. Okay, let's see. It is... I have to do my stupid password. It's 10:20, so we have another 10 minutes if you guys want to mill around. It sounds like you guys don't have questions that you want everyone to hear, so I'm just going to hang out here, and y'all can go get coffee and hang out. Thank you very much.